Hey there, gang. We are in Glen Oak, Wisconsin, and we are in Amish country. We are at a cemetery here. It is called the Greenwood Presbyterian Church Cemetery. And just driving down the back roads here, the two-lane highways, you do see the families, the Amish with their spring wagons and horses. Coming down the road here, there was one with a little boy with his hat in the back, holding his hat on because it's very windy here today. And I gave him a wave and he waved back. Gave me a really good feeling. You just think about the simpler times. I really envy those people here and all around. In a way, they live the simple life. I'm looking at a farm right over here. There are no cars. There are 3 wagons. It just looks like paradise. Speaking of paradise, let's walk this little cemetery and talk about a boy who is in paradise right now. Little boy, a very, very sad story that happened back in the 1800s. He was an immigrant with his family from England, and a lot of bad luck and a lot of bad things happened. But they remember him here, so let me show you his grave, and on the way we'll see what we can here at Greenwood, see what we can see. Hopefully my wind microphone is working. So, yeah, his name was Emmanuel Dannan. He was born in 1843. He was the youngest of 5 children. I should say 5 surviving children. Emmanuel was 2 years old. There was 3-year-old Anne, who would die that same year. There was 5-year-old Elizabeth, 7-year-old Jane, 9-year-old John, and a 12-year-old sister named Marianne. Now, the last child only lived 8 months, dying in 1847. And I believe it was a little boy. Well, the parents, they decided to come here, Mary and Benjamin Dannan. They emigrated from Devon in England, and they had to leave the graves of two of their children. They were boys that were born before the rest that were mentioned. It was said that Emmanuel was a very intelligent little boy, bright blue eyes, and he had as they said, a very winning smile, winning in his playful little ways. Now, the father, Benjamin, he was a sexton of St. Paul's Church. They had moved to Milwaukee, and in 1846, he died of tuberculosis. And then, shockingly, on June 22nd of 1847, Mother Mary also died. Very, very sad. This was the same year William died, as mentioned before. Very unforgiving back then. We don't know how they died, but we know that there were many diseases and many accidents and many things that happened in those days. So the kids were all orphans. Luckily, though, an uncle took them in, all the children, an uncle who loved them. But then guess what happened? The uncle died too. Now there was no one. So they all had to be taken by the state and put in. Some of them were placed in foster homes, but Emmanuel went to the Milwaukee poorhouse. Fortunately, though, and maybe unfortunately, but at the time it seemed fortunate, he was adopted by a couple, Samuel Woodruff Norton and his wife Elsie. They took Emmanuel here to stay in this town. It was at the time frontier country, and it was called Marquette. They would end up having two children, another one adopted, and her name, we don't know, it's lost to history, but at least he had a little sister. He wasn't by himself. Now, there's a couple of versions to this story. One involves the peddler. Of course, this all has to do with what Emmanuel witnessed, got him in trouble. And the other story, which gains more favor, I think, is, well, it's hard to know which is true to legend, but had to do with his mother. There was something strange about this couple, and nobody could put their finger on it, but there was a peddler who had disappeared, and they found his horse in their pasture. So they think that they might have obviously murdered him, and they seem to be nefarious people. The way they treated their children, as you're going to hear, you could probably put two and two together and just know that they were evil people, terrible people. Well, one day, Emmanuel saw something that Elsie did, something bad, and he told his little sister about it, and she went to mom, stepmom, and she said, you know, guess what Emmanuel told me that you did? Oh, and that made Elsie, stepmom, really mad. Now, these kids probably were not treated well. In fact, many of the kids of the day, the orphans, they were brought to these areas, the farms, to work. The boys would work. And thank you, Deb, by the way, the orphan train it was called. It was kind of a little bit later, but all this was going on. These adopted kids would be sent all across the country to, and you know, mostly many good homes, but a lot of homes, they were like slaves. And the girls to cook and clean, and the boys would just spend their lives out in the pasture breaking their backs. Like just, you know, let's get some orphans, and you know, we can have some slaves, at least until they're old enough to figure it out. So they took the little boy, little Emmanuel, and she went to her husband and she said, Elsie said, tell him that you're lying. And he said, I'm not lying. I'm just telling the truth. And she got even madder. And she said, she went to her husband and she said, you need to punish Emmanuel. You make him not tell this what he's saying, that it's not true. And Emmanuel, he was 8 years old. He's like, no, I'm telling the truth. I'm telling the truth. So you know what the guy did? He took Emmanuel and he tied his wrists with cord and he hung him up like an animal just off his feet in the barn off a rafter, and he started beating him. He started beating him for 2 hours straight. And finally, little Emmanuel, you know, was 8 years old. The poor guy, he looked at his dad. He said, Pa, I'm cold. Then he died. Very sad story. Well, they wouldn't get away with it. The word came down and the boy was brought in and the coroner got involved. So the coroner saw Emmanuel's body and he was shell-shocked. He said that every part of his body was beaten. There wasn't a spot on his body that didn't have either a scratch or a cut or black and blue. By the way, isn't it nice how they take care of the stones here? Look at this, all clean. Although, you know, I always say I kind of like it untouched like that, but this does look beautiful. So they would end up getting charged with manslaughter, probably at first charged with murder. They went to trial. They were sentenced to either 5 years in prison or 10 years in prison, depending on the story. We thought it was 5 years from the records that Deb found. But they did hard labor. By the 1870 census, they were living in Liberty, Iowa. They got out of here. They weren't coming back here. It is shown in the 1880 census that Elsie was dead and Samuel was married to a widow. Her name was Elizabeth Crocker Bunner, and living in Kansas. He died in 1911, Samuel did, and he's buried in McMinnville, Oregon. Elsie's grave is unknown. And you know what? They should be forgotten. Well, right up ahead is little Emmanuel's grave right there to the right. Let's go take a look. You know, going back to 1858 here, a family named Crookers moved Emmanuel's body here from the farmland. This was a tiny little settler cemetery. I guess you could still say it's a tiny little cemetery. I mean, the settlers, you look here, these names. These are the people that settled this area. Young Charles. About 50 years later, a woman named Mrs. Utke put a small rock right here where this big monument is. She just put it on the ground here, and that was the only marker until 1954, when the Milwaukee Sentinel ran a story about the little boy, Emmanuel. And we have to credit, from what I understand, two gentlemen, one named Clarence Troost Jr. I don't know if there's any relation to our friend Frank Troost of the Troost Monuments, but anyway, Clarence Troost of the Montello Granite Company and Omar Bittman of the Bittman Monument Company of Milwaukee contributed this marker. They put this marker in. The boy who would not lie. Emmanuel Dannan. So he is not forgotten. There's a nice verse there. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:10. And they put his name on the back, so when you come here, you can find it very easily. Well, very sad story, guys. But it happened a lot. I'm sure it happened a lot. I'm not saying that they hung kids and beat them, but these farmers, many good families, most good, but some bad. You can only imagine what happened to these kids that were sent out here. All the hard labor, the diseases, the hardships. But back in those days, I think the mortality rate, depending on where you are, was anywhere between 30 to 40%. You lost half your kids, if not most of them, to disease, mostly to disease. But yeah, as I look out here, there's the Amish family right now working their farm. See if I can zoom in here. Yeah, look at that. Isn't that a beautiful thing? God bless them. Rest in peace, Emmanuel.